Hi there, I'm Jennifer Cunningham. I'm the AVP of Alumni Relations at Lehigh, and this is our Mountain Talk for today. Very, very popular topic. We are so lucky to have Professor George DuPaul on with us today to talk about ADHD youth during quarantine. He is from the College of Education, and this is one in a series that the College of Ed is doing. So we'll give you some more information about the upcoming webinars on that, so you can tune into them weekly. All right, so a little choreography before we get it kicked off. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says chat. Just push that button and you'll see a screen pop up that allows you to chat, and that's how we will be taking your questions after the 5 or 10 minutes where Professor DuPaul will give a chat on the topic, and I will read those questions aloud to him so that he doesn't have to squint and try to manage the chat, which I'm sure will be very lively today. When you are chatting, please do remember there are, let's see now, almost 200 other people on the webinar, so try to keep your questions somewhat broad and not about your specific individual situation. I think that will make the talk as interesting as possible for everybody. And after the Mountain Talk, we will be sending out a 2-page document of resources for you. So web links and descriptions and various places you can go for more information. All right, let's get started. Professor DuPaul.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with everyone out there today. And I hope that everybody is doing well and staying safe and staying healthy. On all of your families as well. So it's my pleasure to talk to you a little bit today about challenges that we all have, those of us who are living with individuals with ADHD, children and youth with ADHD in particular, and as well as those of you who are educators out there working with this population. We're certainly living in unprecedented times, and unprecedented in particular in terms of the challenges that parents and teachers face just under typically developing circumstances, never mind throwing into the mix youth who might have a disability like ADHD, which certainly intensifies the challenges that we experience. So I just wanted to mention a few things to kind of have you think about and that you might consider in terms of meeting some of the challenges that you're facing. One of the most important things that I can emphasize is that you set realistic goals for yourself as parents and teachers. I think that in many ways, we want to just maintain where we were pre-COVID if we can. This is particularly acute in terms of educational challenges. There have been some research organizations who have postulated that that there's going to be a huge COVID slide is the terminology that people are using in the education field, that there's going to be a loss of learning that was already gained prior to COVID in the current school year. And the estimates are that there'll be about a 30% loss of reading skills, post-COVID, and that'll be up to about 50% loss in mathematics skills post-COVID. And that, again, is under, typical circumstances, not talking about students with ADHD who already experience perhaps academic challenges. And so one of the things that I think we need to think about is setting realistic goals of just trying to maintain skills, maybe not build skills beyond where they were, but trying to maintain is perhaps a realistic goal for teachers and parents. Another thing that we certainly want to accomplish during this time is to keep our children engaged as much as possible with school. And the key phrase there is as much as possible, and being realistic there. We're obviously not going to replicate 6-hour school days on Zoom. I think we would all have mental health challenges if we were on Zoom 6 hours straight per day, never mind a child with ADHD. And so we need to think about small doses of engagement and breaking that up with opportunities for the child to do other things, so that we're not asking for sustained attention to a screen and academic engagement for long periods of time. We have to be realistic about that. The other thing that's really important for all of us all of us in general, but particularly all of us working with kids with ADHD, is not to forget self-care and to take care of ourselves in terms of the challenges we're facing personally and perhaps even physically as a result of the COVID crisis. And we are going to be in the best position to help our kids if we're taking care of ourselves. It's kind of the equivalent of if we're on an airplane and you get that notice at the beginning that with the oxygen mask that might fall down, that you need to put your own mask on before you help somebody else. It's kind of the equivalent. We need to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves to the degree that we can be as helpful as possible to kids with ADHD. And then I wanted to just go through a few more specific items, and if we can get the slide, Jennifer, on that. Specific items around some strategies or some general thoughts, particularly for parents, although these certainly could apply for teachers as well. One of the things that I think is really important when we're thinking about living at home and trying to work with kids with ADHD and keep them on target is a big concern or a big strategy that we would think about is predictability. Meaning that we would maintain routines as much as we can from the pre-COVID time in terms of wake times, meal times, amount of screen time, although that's certainly going to go up, and bedtime. Try to keep the youth on a regular schedule and build in routines is going to help to actually allay some anxieties that children may have. It's the more that they can feel like things are normal, at least in terms of routines, really helps. Kind of the flip side of that is you probably all experienced the phenomenon, I certainly have, of what day is it? This like every day seems to be the same now. Weekends are no different than weekdays. And one of the things that I think is really helpful to build in some novelty for your children and maybe have different themes across days in terms of the kind of activities you might engage in, so that there is some marker of variety, if you will, across the week. Another thing to think about is to think ahead and to be planful as you're working with your child. And that can be in terms of being as clear-cut as possible about your expectations for a given activity, for a given period of time, and to communicate that as clearly and explicitly as possible, even if you think they already know what it is that's expected, to make sure that you're explicit about it. The other thing is to have a bank of activities that they may choose from in anticipation that they may become bored. I think that that's a frequent thing that we're going to hear from kids. We're already hearing from kids, particularly those with ADHD. And so if we have a variety of activities that we might put in like a box, an activity box, where we have a listing on separate pieces of paper, different activities, and the child may, each day pull from that box and then engage in that particular activity. Again, builds in some variety, builds in some structure, and perhaps can address proactively some of the boredom or other challenges that they may experience. Another key strategy, of course, as is always the case, but particularly post-COVID or during COVID, I should say, is to communicate as clearly as possible. And that includes not only our expectations for behavior, but also in terms of acknowledging the anxiety that they may be experiencing and communicating our own anxieties in a way that is coping. So serving as a coping model and admitting, yes, I'm nervous about going to the grocery store, but here's what I'm going to do to cope with that. Here's how I'm going to deal with that. And so you're modeling the communication, the verbal communication of being anxious, but also modeling and expressing how we can go about that, what strategies we can engage in proactively ahead of time to reduce that anxiety or to address that anxiety. The other thing that we should be communicating as clearly as possible is accurate information about COVID and the implications for our families and for schooling. To be as transparent as possible about that, because there's a lot of misinformation, as you all know, I'm sure, about this. And so kids really want to know, they want accurate information, even if it's bad news. And I think you can couch it that way. It's bad news, but here's how we're going to handle it. Here's how we're going to cope with it as a family, or here's how we're going to cope with it as a school. So that there's a transparency of the information, but then a plan to follow that. Positive management strategies are particularly critical for kids with ADHD in general, but are particularly critical during these challenging times. We want to catch them being good. We want to set them up for success. So any activities that we are asking them to do, particularly those that involve schoolwork or chores or whatever, we keep those to a particular time frame. We make our expectations clear, and then when they successfully complete those, that we're praising that, we're giving them access to things that they enjoy following that, we're giving them breaks along the way, so that there's a positive context to that management. And we can tie that back into this activity box that I mentioned, the bank of activities. Perhaps it's where they complete a certain amount of schoolwork or other type of work, and then they get to choose an activity from the box of activities that maybe involves interaction between you and the child, which can be particularly valuable if it's in a positive context. It could counterbalance maybe some of the challenges or arguments or negative interactions that are happening at other times of the day. And then the final thing that I would want to emphasize for all of us, particularly again for those of us parenting and teaching kids with ADHD, is to practice optimism, which is extremely challenging these days. I know that for myself, that it's easy to become pessimistic about things for obvious reasons. So it's really critical for us to identify those pessimistic thoughts, recognize them, but then challenge them in different ways. One way is that we can use distractors we can, whenever a pessimistic thought occurs to us around our parenting, for example, or our teaching, that we're not being successful, maybe we distract ourselves with deep breathing, with thinking of a funny phrase or a song that we can be thinking about. So something to take us away from that pessimistic thought. The other thing that we can do is try to challenge those pessimistic thoughts in terms of, okay, yeah, maybe I'm struggling having my child follow through today, but I was successful last week and I'll be successful again. And these are some of the things that I can do to be successful. So recognizing that kernel of pessimism, but then translating that to more optimistic thoughts based on prior experience, as well as the plans that we have to be successful in the future. So at this point, we can turn things over to any questions that you may all have.
Great, thank you, George. Yes, we have some questions coming in. Mary and Sean have a very similar question about the screen time. Mary asking about how long students should be on Zoom daily, and Sean asking how often or how long they can be on things like Fortnite or other video games. Do you have a time limit?
I think that varies by the age of the child and the expectations for them. Younger children, it's going to be shorter bursts of Zoom or other kind of screen activity and shorter periods of time with other screen events. And then with older kids, it's going to be lengthening. I think the key thing there is to negotiate expectations with them up front and say, here are the guidelines that we're going to follow. We're going to try that out. Let's see how this works. 15 minutes here, 30 minutes there. And let's see if that's successful, and be willing to renegotiate, perhaps lengthen times, but depending on how they're doing with school engagement. So I don't know if there's cut and dried time, but it's about being proactive and negotiating and being flexible in terms of changing the time over the course of whether the things are being successful or not.
Right. Heather suggests that the Palouse Institute offers a free 8-week mindfulness course, which may be helpful for parents in dealing with these situations. that is helpful. And then another Heather asks, when the meltdown happens, what can we do to manage and recover?
Yeah, so when meltdowns happen, which could be more frequent now, right? Because one of the ways that kids can show some of their anxieties by reverting to younger behaviors or perhaps more emotionally challenging behaviors. So there's a number of things that we can do. I think we can, if it's safe to do so, and you feel yourself getting emotionally charged up, you remove yourself from the situation for a little bit. Get some distance from the child, gather your thoughts, make sure that you're responding in a less emotional tone, and being very matter of fact about what the expectations are for stopping the meltdown and moving on to the next activity. And then once that does happen, assuming that it does happen, we capitalize on that by praising and positively reinforcing the child for, hey, you really turned things around. You had a meltdown there a little bit earlier, and now you're a much better control. You're calming yourself, and that's really a good thing. And let's keep that up.
Right. Okay. Do you have any recommendations for how blended learning should take place when we finally begin reopening?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the million-dollar question, right? Of how we go forward with education in general. I don't have a specific recommendation based on any evidence. We've never gone through anything like this before, so it's really hard to say what that's going to look like. I think where the blended learning needs to emphasize we need to think strategically what can be accomplished in a successful way through Zoom or asynchronous web delivery, and what really needs to have more face-to-face contact, and typically more of those hands-on kinds of skills that we need to build are going to probably require more face-to-face delivery of instruction than online. But so that's going to vary. That mix, that ratio is going to vary as a function of the age of the child, the type of skill that we're trying to build, and so forth. So I don't know that anybody has any magic answer to that yet. It's going to be something that we're going to have to discover through trial and error.
Right. There's some questions on here about increasing motivation levels, and like if there's other kids in the house that are getting their work done, how do you motivate the ADHD child while also juggling those kids?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think there's a couple of things to think about. One is you can think about something we call pivot praise, where you're making sure that you are praising and reinforcing and rewarding the youngsters that are doing well, and being very specific about what they're doing well as a way to prompt the child with ADHD. Okay, this is what my parent wants me to do now. And for me to be able to get praised or reinforced, I need to pivot to that behavior. The other thing that we can think about is perhaps some kind of more family-wide reinforcer that everybody contributes to in different ways, so that we'll get pizza tonight if we're all able to chip in with our individual things that we need to accomplish. Okay, and so everybody might have different expectations in terms of what they need to do, and the child with ADHD should have some kind of realistic goal with that, so that they feel good about the fact that they've contributed to the family-wide reinforcer, if you will, or the family-wide preferred activity.
Right. This is a good question from Robert. When should we get professional help?
Professional help, I assume, around ADHD as what
Right.
the question is referring to.
I think so. Yeah. Like, as the children are home all day and things seem amplified, at what point do you pull the trigger and say, all right, I've got to get some professional help here. It's just out of control.
Yeah, well, and that last phrase there is key, out of control. That if you feel that it's impairing the family life to the degree where things do feel out of control, more than one person in the family is not able to get done what they need to get done, and it's really impacting the day-to-day functioning of the family, then that is a clear sign that professional support may be necessary.
Right. And the question from Jane: the role of trauma in COVID pandemic is obvious, but how do children with ADHD respond differently with regard to trauma?
Excellent question. Not something that, by the way, we have extensive research on, although there is some. I think the general rule when thinking about kids with ADHD is that every challenge that you would expect or see for a typically developing kid in terms of how they respond, you multiply that exponentially for kids with ADHD. And so the reaction to trauma is going to be probably qualitatively similar to what other kids might experience in terms of crying or some depressive symptoms or withdrawal or acting out in some way and having problems with emotion regulation. That's going to happen for kids with ADHD, but at a much more intense level and perhaps a much more frequent level that's going to require more sustained support either from family members or outside the family, depending on the level of impairment.
Right, and it's sort of added on to that. Amy's question is about that, how much of this is just kids coping with trauma right now, and how much is it ADHD kid coping with trauma, and any differences in how you would address that?
I think that a lot of the things that we would do under typical circumstances, non-COVID circumstances for kids with ADHD, now need to be done for typically developing kids. It's kind of like all that we've learned in terms of dealing with behavioral, emotional challenges pre-COVID could now really be applicable for just kids in general.
Right.
And so what do we do with the kids with ADHD? Well, we need to step up the frequency, consistency, and positive context that we're hopefully already doing pre-COVID to manage the ADHD. We've got to step up our game even more.
Right. A couple questions here from Colleen and Christina about how do you keep your child on task without feeling like you're nagging, things like surfing the internet and doing other things when you think they're working. You just don't want to be focusing. Don't get so distracted. How do you manage that as a parent?
Yeah, that's real challenge now. And I think it's really important that we don't get into a nagging pattern. By the same token, we do need to prompt and reinforce them for following through. And I think that's where it gets back to the kind of realistic goals. You kind of get a feel for, okay, here's where we're at right now. My child's able to, sustain it for about 10 minutes and then they're drifting off. Okay, let's start with those 10 minutes. Let's praise them for those 10 minutes, give them a break after those 10 minutes, and let's build it up day to day. Let's get it to 11 minutes. Let's get it to 12 minutes. So we're building gradually from where they are now so that we're being realistic about it. And again, I can't emphasize enough that we need to be giving them breaks. And if the more we can control the break time and the break activity, it helps to structure things so that they're not going off into a different, track.
Right. Question from Danielle: how do we balance realistic expectations with teachers who feel pressure to prevent the loss of skill that you described?
Yeah, I think that's where, parents and teachers are going to have to communicate clearly with each other. And again, come to some consensus about, okay, here's where the student is at right now in terms of skills. We need to maintain that. What are the ways that I, as a parent, can help support that outside of the teacher relationship? And how can the teacher contribute, to that? What's the best way for us to operate? And take it as a trial kind of thing. Okay, let's, over the next couple of weeks, let's engage in these things and see how it works. And then let's meet again, let's talk again and see what adjustments we need to make based on how things are going.
Yeah. Can you make some recommendations on how to refoster some independent play for children? They're really regressing since being at home with us full time.
Yeah, so I think that's where maybe what we start with is we're playing with them. Okay, we're doing some kind of special activity with them that they choose a play activity where we're playing with them, and maybe the first couple of times we stay with them for a little bit, but then over time we start at only we start off with them with this special activity, and then after about 10 minutes we drift off into some other activity and they keep going, and so that and then we get shorter and shorter amount of time that we're starting the activity, so that they get used to going back to that independence. So we're starting with them, and then we're gradually fading out our involvement over time is kind of the way I would think about it.
Got it. There's a couple of questions here from Jeremy and Nina. How can you continue to build upon teaching social emotional learning in youth when they're unable to physically interact with their classmates?
Yeah, see, that's where you get to the realistic expectation. We probably can't build. What we can do is try to maintain. And we can use the challenge of COVID to think about specific social emotional skills, learning skills to focus on, of coping, right? Of coping in appropriate ways, and respecting each other's space. There are a number of things that can come up in terms of COVID that we can work on, but there are other things that we can't. And we have to acknowledge, okay, we can't work on those skills in this context. And we'll come back to them hopefully at a later point, but we can't set unrealistic expectations around that.
Right. Charlene asks, at what point does parental assistance in homework and projects with an ADHD teen become a crutch? Many say the child must fail to accept responsibility and teach self-advocacy, but is that true for the ADHD child?
I certainly wouldn't advocate letting them fail. I would, though, say that we need to be clear about, again, what our role is as parents in working with them. And so we may be more hands-on initially to try to get them through that. And then what we want to do is build independence in two ways. One is giving them some instruction in terms of the independence of what they need to do in terms of following through on assignments. And the other is to motivate them. And so, okay, if you're able to do this independently, this part of this homework, then you'll have some screen time, some extra screen time, or we'll do some special activity together individually or as a family. So it's got to be the instructional piece and then the motivational piece.
Right. Okay. There's a few people on here have asked about, it sounds like they may have ADHD themselves as parents. So are there any special advice you would give to parents who also have ADHD in trying to manage their ADHD children?
Yeah, I mean, that gets back to the self-care piece, right? So we need to be able to take care of our own challenges, whether those be ADHD or others, in order to be of best benefit to our child. So if they're not already getting professional help around the ADHD, this would be a good time to seek that out, and to also acknowledge your limits, in the context of that. Yeah.
Okay. One more question, and then we're going to hit 1 o'clock. There's still some questions. There's a lot of chatter on in the chat box. So hopefully the resources that we send out will answer a lot of these about ADHD. But wondering about increased anxiety. Is anxiety a part of like an ADHD diagnosis or not? And are there any coping strategies for anxiety and ADHD?
Yeah, anxiety is not a symptom of ADHD, but is a frequent, what we call comorbidity, meaning an associated problem. Probably about 20 to 30% of individuals with ADHD, particularly adolescents and young adults, will have an anxiety disorder or significant anxiety symptoms. So it does correlate. In terms of coping, it's a lot of the things that we would do with somebody who just had anxiety without ADHD, and that is providing some strategies, what we call cognitive behavioral strategies of recognizing cognitions or thoughts that set off anxious reactions, identifying those and trying to change those thoughts, as well as giving them behavioral strategies, relaxation training, and other kinds of things. The mindfulness that you mentioned earlier, those kinds of things. So we have the recognition of thoughts and trying to change those thoughts, and then also providing some strategies for dealing with the anxious symptoms when they occur.
Great. All right, that is all the time we have for today, but I do want to remind everyone we will be sending out this recording along with resources. So if you joined us midway or want to hear the great advice, and thank you so much, Professor DuPaul, it was really helpful. You can watch the recording again. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy your weekends.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe, everybody. Good luck.